Starting with language, you mentioned that it's this autoregressive system that you have these inputs and they feed back into each other. Can you just give a brief, the kind of simplified definition for SLPs
Okay.
who might not be familiar with, LLMs?
Absolutely. And I use that word so often. People make fun of it. They make drinking games out of it. I should just define it right off the bat. But it's basically the following. The idea is that you have a function. And a function is just, we all know about functions. You have an input and an output. An input could be, like a set of numbers. Let's say you could have, a simple function would be you take two numbers and you give me the sum. You take two numbers, you give me, the product, right? That's a simple idea of a function. It's a mapping, and you can build a computer system that does this, that produces this kind of function. Now, in the case of autoregression, there's one extra step, and that's it. Instead of just saying you take an input and produce an output, the trick is you take that output and then tack it on to the original input and then feed it in again. And then you produce another output. And so what you've got is a function, really just the sort of core computational structure. The thing itself, you can think of it as a computer or a recipe, an algorithm. You could write it down, however you want to write down or describe this thing that takes inputs and produces outputs. But you've got that thing, right? And then you take that thing and you do this autoregression, namely you take its output and you feed it back into itself. And so this is the idea of recursion, right? That you're taking an output, feeding back in, like like the Urso, really like the snake eating its own tail. But you don't just feed it its own output again, because if you just kept doing that, you'd just end up in a sort of a tractor and you'd end up someplace very uninteresting. But what you're doing in the case of autoregression, in particularly with like large language models, is you're taking that output and you're tacking on to the previous inputs, right? So if I give a large language model, I say, hey, tell me a story. Okay, so it takes that input, tell me a story. And what it's going to do is that's its input and it's going to produce an output. That output in the case of large language models is what do you think the very next, it's called a token, but you can think of it as a word. What do you think the very next word should be? So if I say to you, Garrett, tell me a story, you might be like, okay, once upon a time, right? So the first thing you'd say is okay, right? You take that okay, and then you take that okay and tack it onto the tell me a story. Okay, you have that sequence, stick that in, run it again. Now you take the same function. Same exact function, very important, right? The same function, but it's a new input because now it has the word okay at the end. Stick it in, now you say okay once. And now you say once, and then you feed that whole thing in again. And then you say, okay, once upon, right? And so what's happening is this thing is generating its own inputs, right? And it's doing this in a sequential manner so that it's building up these incremental inputs. And then that's the whole trick. So this single function, the function isn't thinking about further tokens, not thinking about the whole sequence. Its job is just to do one thing. Tell me the next token. But by doing it autoregressively, by doing it, feeding it back into itself, you end up with this process. It's not, the function itself is just a function, input, output, but function plus autoregression gives you a process, and that process then can give you infinite length sequences, right? It can tell you a story, it can write a book, it can give you a long explanation on any esoteric topic you want, but it's doing it all of this just based on this in some ways, very simple predictive model. And so that's the sort of core concept of autoregression. Regression just means, prediction, basically, like you may be familiar with like linear regression. You've got a bunch of data and you're trying to, based on that, you're trying to plot some new data point. And you regress a line and you come up with a model. Based on this, here's my predictive model. So it's sort of a predictive model and it's autoregression, right? Because it takes its prediction, feeds it back into itself, and then does it again. And that's sort of the whole magic of autoregression.